Hello, welcome to another worm farming Q&A live on White Davy Gardening and Worm Farm. So today we're going to be talking some more about worms. I must apologize for being a bit late today. I'm running behind schedule. Okay, so we're going to be a bit over the place as we discuss worms today. So you may notice that in my title I did not put anything that is definite. A question that a lot of beginners tend to ask is, what are the best composting worms? And so I'm going to tell you the five most popular composting worms, and they are popular because they are the best. There are other types of composting worms, some of which, although they're very good, excellent composters, some of them are actually not recommended for use. For example, that Alabama jumping worm, which is actually very devastating for whatever location they occupy because they will destroy your crops. So, the five most popular composting worms are the red wrigglers. This is the most popular of them all, followed by the European nightcrawler, the African nightcrawler, the blue worm, and the Canadian nightcrawlers. The Canadian nightcrawlers are not as popular as the other nightcrawlers because they are a bit trickier to raise. So if you are not raising them for commercial purposes, then it can be expensive for you to raise them because you're going to have to provide them with some form of system that will keep them cool. But outside of the Canadian night crawlers, the red wrigglers, the European night crawlers, the African night crawlers, and the blue worms, these are pretty good. They don't require much, but if you're going to be, oh, hi CC, if you're going to be raising them, you need to consider the environment that you live in because the Canadian night crawlers require a very cool environment. The European night crawlers and the red wrigglers are tolerant to both warmth and cool weather, but they do better more on the cooler side than if it's hot. If you're in an hot environment where most of the year it is hot, then the African night crawlers and the blue worms will work pretty well. The red wigglers will work in this environment as well. Hi, Han White. How are you, my beautiful little sister? Who are you calling your little sister? Uh, yes, so these are the most popular types of composting worms. I've never really looked into other types of composting worms because if these are the best, then I don't necessarily want to be raising something or other worms that are less than the best. The red wrigglers are considered the most popular because of their ferocious eating habit combined with their rate of reproduction. Because out of all the composting worms, the red wigglers are the ones that reproduce the fastest. Let's see. And White says she's well. Okay, good. Okay, so how can you make worm castings faster, especially this time of year when the garden season is about to begin? We are definitely interested in increasing our production of castings so that we can have enough for our gardens. And if you're someone who has really large garden, then you know that It's going to take a lot of work on the part of your worms, especially if you don't have a lot of worms. So, what steps can you take to ensure that your worms will produce castings faster? Well, for one, you can feed them chopped or blended food scraps because the more surface area the food has, the faster it's going to break down. The worms do not eat your food scraps, they feed on the microbes and other bacteria that is on the food scraps. And so you want to have more surface area breaking down and producing these microbes and other bacteria for the worms to feed on. So chopping and blending works well. Feeding them food scraps that is already breaking down is a good way because, like I said, it will have more microbes and other bacteria on it for the worms to eat. Freezing and thawing is another method that works pretty well. So you want to freeze the food scraps, and this method works especially if you produce a lot of food scraps that is more than your worms can consume within a particular period of time. Freezing it, thawing it, but when you thaw it, you have to make sure that it is at room temperature. Worms do not like when temperatures fluctuate on them. So, for that reason, then you want to make sure that it is at a similar temperature to what is in your worm bin. So, although I say room temperature, it's pretty much as close to the temperature that is in your worm bin as possible. Now, depending on what your worms are being fed, sifting your worm food might be another option to help them to speed up their casting production. I Serenity Blue, thoughts on rice. Heard people say it is good for worm bins. It is good for your worm bin because the worms will feed on it. I don't have much experience with using rice in worm bin. The only time I feed my worms rice is actually if I have rice that have been cooked for a while, and then I'll just throw it out. I'll throw it in the worm bin, but I've never really monitored them to see if they consume it quickly or how long it lasts in the worm bin or anything. So they will eat it because it is plant based, it is organic, but how much do they love it? I don't know. I know that if it is cooked, they're going to be consuming it faster because it is softer, which means it's going to break down more readily and more microbes are going to be growing on it in when it is soft because it's breaking down. So more food for your worms to eat. It's a good question though. Hmm. I might want to try a little worm bin, one of my little experimental worm bin, and just feed them on rice and see what happens. You're welcome, Serenity. Maybe I should jot that down. That's another little experiment for me to do. Okay, thanks for that idea. I like to do experiments with worm. I get to learn a lot from them. Okay, so I'll be watching. Okay. Yeah, so the last point I mentioned, I was saying that based on what you're feeding your worms, then sifting the food scraps might be an option. For example, a lot of you who have been following me for a while know that finished compost is a major part of my worm food. So sifting it will help to remove large particles that are probably not something the worms are going to be feeding on. For example, if it has wood chips or maybe a few stones or something that is unwanted in there, in addition to whatever part of the compost has not broken down small enough yet, you remove that by sifting it, then the smaller portions the worm will be able to consume faster. Now, you might not be able, outside of these things, you might not be able to get your worms to consume faster, but it's a good idea to start your worm bin much earlier than you need to, so that you can have castings when the time comes around. Because based on a pattern that I have been seeing in the past almost 4 years, people who order worms, they tend to order worms more during March and April, May. But at that point in time, if you're going to be ordering worms for your to start a worm bin, the chances of you having castings for your garden for that year, especially if you don't have a long growing season, is very slim, because it can take between 3 to 6 months for your worms to produce enough castings to be of any consequence to your garden. So it might be a good idea to start your worm bin months in advance, so that you can have enough castings to use. That doesn't mean that if it is April or May, you're going to sit and wait until next year, January, to start your worm bin, because you want to produce as much castings as possible. But if you know that you need castings for this growing season, then if you are able to start early, then the earlier you start, the better it is. Let's see. And Mike says, "Oh, I didn't know that you sifted. Thanks, because I will be adding finished compost to my summer worm bin." Okay. Yes, I sift it. I don't really like the large particles in there. And there are some things, as I mentioned before, that the worms will not be eating, and especially depending on where your compost is coming from too. So for me, I create my own compost. So I feed them compost from my compost bin. But then, whether or not I'm feeding the compost to the worms or I am putting it in my garden, I always sift my castings, my not my castings, but my compost. Yes, so I do sift them. And if you're buying compost to feed and you're going to be feeding that to your worms, or if you source compost from anywhere else, it may contain particles that the worms are not going to feed on. So sifting it is a pretty good idea. Hi, Majan. Happy to see you. Good afternoon. Okay. Same here. I'm glad you were able to join us. How is your evening or your afternoon going? Yeah, so I do sift my compost before I feed it to my worms. And depending on the size sifter you use too, because some people, when they're sifting their compost, they will use a half-inch screen, they will use a quarter-inch screen, or they will use a 1/8 inch screen. For me, I use the quarter-inch screen, mostly because that's the screen I made when I first started composting for my garden and not to feed my worms. But I think I might be going to the 1/8 inch screen, since as I have one that I use to sift my castings. So I'll be experimenting with that as well, to be sifting my casting with the 1/8, not the castings, but the compost with the 1/8 screen, and to see how that works for my worms, if they're going to be eating faster or not, which I expect them to do. Let's see now. Very well. I was actually looking up information on Google and YouTube, wondering if worms can deal with volcanic ash. Hmm, interesting. So, what did you find? Are they able to deal with it? Funny, my husband and I were just talking to the kids last night about volcanoes, and we were telling them that the best place to grow any form of crop is where volcano ash falls, because the minerals and nutrients in it is just superb. Yeah, and I was wondering if I could maybe get my hands on some of that, but I never really thought about it in terms of the worms eating it. That is a pretty interesting thing. So if you find any information, please do feel free to share. Knowledge is power, they say. Let's see. Serenity Blue says, new at this. Started bin two. Oh, started bin 2 weeks ago. I used a few aged goats droppings in it. Do you use manure at all? No, I do not. I would love to get my hands on some rabbit droppings, but I don't know where I would get that. Well, I could get them rabbit compost from the stores, but I don't really buy anything that I'm going to be feeding my worms. And I'm thinking of adding the compost that I get from the compost depot for free to my worm bin as well. I'm gonna be trying it in maybe one of the bin and see how it works. I'm not sure what it is made of. Sometimes when I'm collecting it, it kind of smell like horse manure, but I know it will not be just horse manure. If it is in there, it will be a combination of different things because the compost that the depot makes is based on what people in the community would drop off at their location, and then they would compost it and give it back to the community. So I'm thinking of feeding that to some of my worms and see how it works out. Yes, but they do love and do well with manure as long as it is aged or composted. Hi Russell, I apologize for taking so long to get to you. Wonderful day to you too. Okay, you weren't able to find anything on it. Oh, too bad. But yes, if you have access to the volcano ash, you could try it on a few of your worms. Just get a small bin and use that to feed them and see how they perform. See if they survive it, if they like it, if they do better. And if they do, try it on one plant or two and see how the plant work turns out, if it is good for the plant, yes or no. That would be interesting. Now I wish I had my hands on some of that. I could actually do an experiment. So, Bejan, do you have access to volcanic ash? That sounds like a fun experiment. Let's see. Oh, you froze up. I did? Oh, wasn't aware of that at all. Sorry, because everything is moving freely on my end, so I don't know. And I didn't get a notification that having internet issues. Okay, so apart from red wrigglers, ENC, ANC, CNCs, and blue worms, there are other types of composting worms that you can use. Some of them, like the Alabama jumping worm, is not necessarily recommended because they wreak havoc in the natural environment, but they are extremely good composters, I hear. But the sad thing about it is that if you have them, I know that, as Russell mentioned, in the States they are trying to destroy the population of them. But unlike other worms, for these Alabama jumping worms, which is called by many other names, usually including jumping worms, so whatever preceding jumping worms, they you only need one or one of their eggs for them to have a large population because unlike other worms, they don't need two worms to multiply, they just need one. So yeah, so there are lots of other composting worms, but as I said before, I like to stick to the most popular ones because they're popular for a reason. Let's see. Russell says free compost is excellent compost for feeding worm as long as it does not have a snake worm in it. Yeah. Um, I don't really know that there is any snake worm in my location, so that is good. So I'm gonna be definitely going to be trying it. I went there yesterday for the first time since the compost depot opened and got some compost, but I'm not really using that for worms just yet. I am still working on adding more compost to my backyard so that I can reseed it with the grass. Okay, let's see. Hi, Rano. Don't use cat or dog poop or any carnivore or omnivores which eat meat too. These animals can be invaded or infected with a bunch of parasite worms and bacteria. That is so true. Oh, hi, garden worm lady. Well, garden lady and worms. I don't know why I always say garden worm lady. It's been a while. How are you? Okay, so Serenity Blue. Ronald, no worry there, but I have goats, so okay, good. So you have a nice supply right on your hand there. That's nice. Oh, you're taking a break at work, garden lady. Okay. Hi, mom. Okay, so McBajan says no access to volcanic ash. I was thinking of ash across St. Vincent and Barbados and wondering if a huge vermiculture program could help return the ash to compost instead of heaps of waste. Yeah. They could collect it and use it in their garden because it works pretty well. I don't know if you ever notice around areas where you have volcanoes that have erupted that the foliage there and the fruits that they produce is just it's just absolutely phenomenal. They could actually collect it and use it in their gardens and then they would reduce the amount that is piled up in one location. Excuse me just a minute. Okay, sorry about that. So let's see. Serenity says, don't know until you try. That's true. Probably me. Okay, you're doing well, garden lady. You're working a lot. Well, it's good to stay busy. When we don't stay busy, sometimes we get so bored. Just as long as you don't overwork yourself, then it's good. So let's see. Serenity Blue says here about a lot of bin pests that are there any to worry about? Okay. Well, there are some types of worms that can be pests to your worms. They can actually become parasites to your worms. Certain types of nematodes. And while millipede is okay in your worm bin, centipedes will bite. So they will bite you or they will bite your worms, but they are not really dangerous for your worms per se, except that they will bite them occasionally. Um, Ants are not dangerous to your worm bin, but they will compete for the food in your worm bin. They will take the food from your worm bin to their colony, and you know how ants behave, where they will, once one ants come and find your food source, they're gonna take it back to their colony and they're gonna bring more workers with them, and they just keep bringing more and more workers until they have exhausted the food supply. So hence, they are not necessarily dangerous, but they will be a serious competition for your worms if there is too much of them. There are quite a few things that can be negative for your worm bin. You don't want things like rodents in your worm bin because some Rats, for one, do eat worms, mice, not necessarily. But if you have mice or rats in your worm bin, the mice will eat the food scraps that you put in your worm bin. And as you know, the worms tend to gather around the food scraps, which means that the mice are going to be eating by accident the worms that are on the food scraps, because they're not going to tell them, okay, come off the food scraps and go over there so I can eat it. So by accident, some of your worms are going to get killed. Rats on a whole, though, do eat worms, so you don't want to have them in your worm bin. In addition to that, because of how dangerous their dropping is, then you definitely don't want to have that in your worm bins. So there are some animals or insects that you need to look out for in your worm bins. I don't really have much problems with a lot of insect in my worm bin, so I've never really given much thought as to what I don't want in my worm bin. Most of the insects that can be found in your worm bin, they're actually beneficial for your worm bin because they are good composters as well, and they don't necessarily harm your worms. Some of them, though, even though they might be beneficial to your worm bin, you may find that their presence is an indication that something is not right in your worm bin. So things like your like potworms are always in your worm bin, whether or not you see them, yes or no, they're always there. If the population of potworms get large and in a fast period of time, then you know that it's an indication that your bin is either too acidic or it is too moist. A lot of these, like even the spider mites, if your bin is too moist or too acidic, they're going to be there too. So a lot of these insects, their presence indicate that something is not right in your worm bin. Some of them, they're just there because the food source is there. It's not because something is wrong in your worm bin. So you're gonna see a lot of things like potworms in your worm bin. You might see various type of mites, the red ones. If you see their population being too much, you want to get rid of them as quickly as possible, because although they don't harm your worms, for some reason, the worms tend to shy away from them when the population is large, and so that can prevent your worms from eating because they're staying away from the mites. So, yes, be on the lookout for them. So, you can have things like earwigs in your, you can have roly poly, potworms, various type of mites. There are many, many things that you can have in your worm bin. You can have slugs in your worm bins. You don't want snails and slugs in your worm bin because although they're not harmful to your worms, they will lay their eggs, and then when you use that castings, and especially if you're going to be selling your castings, those eggs are going to be in the castings, and then when you use it in your garden or your clients use it in your garden, they're going to end up with a lot of snails and slugs in their garden, which is going to destroy the crop. So these are things that you're going to be looking out for in your worm bins. There's a lot of comments that I am missing out on. Okay. Hi, Leafy Wiggy. Yeah, sorry I took so long to say hi to you. I saw you when you came on, but in the middle of answering a question. Okay, so Rana says goats, pigs, cows, horses, manure is fine most of the time. The most problematic is the dog tinea in dogs' poop. Cats, it can have Toxoplasma gondii. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I guess you wouldn't want to use them then, eh? Yeah, but most of the animals that we raise for crop or for food, most of them their droppings is pretty good for the garden or to feed your worms. Let's see. Matt Bajan says, thank you so much. That was bothering me. I wasn't aware. I'm not Bajan. I am Bajan, but here I'm Bajan. But here I'm thinking of our peoples losing crops. or your right to islands are lush. And you're right, the islands are lush. Mind at ease. Okay, I'm glad I was able to put your mind at ease. Yeah. Rano says chicken manure is problematic too because it contains too much salt and ammonia, which often, especially fresh, it kills the worm if they are in a bin. If it is in a pile, they will go away. Okay. Yes. Well, as it relates to any form of animal dropping, it's always a good idea to have it composted properly before you put it in your worm bin, because the nitrogen from it is going to make your worm bin so hot that it's going to kill your worms. And in addition to that, a lot of the problematic things that are in these droppings will break down when you compost them. So it's a good idea to have them fully composted before using them. Oh, you've never seen any in your bin, Han White? Ooh, fire ants in Texas killed your worms. Wow. I'm sorry about that, my dear. Must be a painful loss. So, what do you use to get rid of the fire ants? You had to start over from scratch. Yes, that is always a painful. I've never had a situation where I've lost all my worms, but I've had the situation where I've lost a worm bin or two. And no matter how much worms you have, if you lose a bin, it is usually pretty painful. But yeah, I'm sorry you had to lose your worms to fire ants. Russell says juggling buckets today. Tomorrow we'll be transplanting tomatoes and peppers into Dixie cups. Get to use the same cell for starting cucumbers. Oh, nice. Melons and squash. Nice. Serenity Blue says garden lady, fire ants kill many things. Our quail population for one. Wow, they sound pretty terrible then that they are able to kill a quail population. How do you control them? Hi, Newark Gardner. How is your afternoon? Okay, so here's a question that a lot of beginners tend to ask regarding separating worms from castings. They like to know how you go about separating it. So there are several options that you can use if you want to separate your worms from your castings. So you can use the light method where you pour the content of your worm bin on a tarp under bright light. It can be the sunlight, but be careful if you're doing it under the sunlight because it can be harmful for your worms if they get exposed directly to it. So you put it under bright light and you create several mounds of castings, and the worms will shy away from the light and keep moving downwards. Then you're going to scrape off the upper layer of the castings that there is no worm in, and you just keep repeating that process. And then in the bottom of that mound that you created, the worms will be down there, and you use those to restart your bin. Another method that you can use is by using horizontal migration, where you put the content of your bin to one side and then you put fresh food scraps to the other side. With time, the worms will migrate over, most of them, not all, and then you can separate the worms from the castings. This method, however, takes a lot of time. It can take weeks, probably even a month or more, for for most of the worms to migrate over. So if you're going to be using this method and you intend to have castings separated from your worms for your garden, then you need to start it long in advance so that the worms will move over and then you can get the castings to use. Okay, so you can also put food scraps in a container and put that container, make sure it's covered so you don't have rodents and other things getting in there. Make sure it is covered. The container must have holes in it so that the worms can go in and out. And then you put food scraps in it, cover it, and bury it into your worm bin. Like the horizontal migration method, the worms are going to gravitate to the food scraps. You're going to check on this occasionally, and those worms that have gathered around the food scraps, you remove them and repeat the process until you've had most of your worms separated from your castings. Or you can simply sift your castings with the worms in it. Now, depending on the type of sifter that you're using, this can either be okay for your worms or it can be a little bit stressful for your worms. So it depends on the type of sifter that you have. No matter what method you use to separate worms from castings, you're going to have some worms remaining in your castings. It's almost impossible to get rid of all the worms from your castings, but these are the methods that you would use to separate them. Okay, so okay, and what Gardner says, fire ants are very dangerous. Thankfully, I don't really have to deal with them here. Let's see, Russell says, I composted a chicken manure slash bedding for 2 years. Then I used on a few pounds of worms. It was a failure. Dumped the rest in the compost in the garden. Oh, I wonder why did it fail? Interesting. Very interesting. Oh, I'm okay, Newark Gardeners. I'm doing okay. Bejan says, yes, Russell, I'm doing peppers this year too. I'm in Muskoka. I hope I pronounced that right. So my outdoor season doesn't start for time. So I always start indoors. What kind of peppers are your favorite to grow? I'm growing peppers too this year. For the first time, I've had peppers grow last year and the year before. The year before, they were like that. And they would not grow any further than that. I don't know. I started it at the start of my growing season, which would be the last week in May, and they didn't grow past that. They had nutrients, they had loose, well drained soil, but they did not grow past that. I'm not sure what happened. But then last year I had two pepper plants that grew to the point where they actually started flowering and had two sweet peppers. They were sweet peppers, two sweet peppers growing on them, but then my growing season ended before I was able to harvest anything, and then we had an early frost which killed one of the plants. So this year, for the first time, I am quite happy where my peppers are concerned because one, I started them pretty early because I started them the 13th of March, and so far, the vast majority have germinated. In December last year, I started just to test some Scotch bonnet seeds that I harvested from a Scotch bonnet pepper that I got from a friend. And I tested 5 seeds and they germinated. So I put them on the grow lights and I saw that they were doing pretty well. So I'm like, nope, I'm not going to get rid of these. Even if I'm going to have to run the grow lights the entire time, I'm going to be growing them. And those peppers are doing pretty well now. They have branches on them, so it's not just the main stalk anymore. So I know that pretty soon they should be able to start producing me some peppers. And I have orange, red, and yellow sweet peppers. I have orange, red, and yellow chili peppers. I have red, orange, and yellow Scotch bonnet peppers. And I have red balm chili which I am testing out for the first time. So I have quite a few peppers growing. So this year, yeah, I think I'm gonna be able to harvest some good peppers. That would be exciting. I just hope they don't fail me the moment I put them outdoors, but I don't think they will. At least all of them can't fail me unless we have really bad weather. And so, because I know how finicky the weather is in Saskatchewan, because wherever you are, it doesn't matter if it is the middle of summer, you always have to have a jacket with you. It might not be a winter jacket, but you always have to have a jacket with you anywhere you're going because the temperature can just drop at any point in time. So, because of that, what I did at the end of the growing season last year was create a frame that I'm going to be putting plastic over so that in case for some reason the weather is not good enough, then I will be putting it over those peppers that mean the most to me so that they can actually produce some peppers. Let's see. Serenity says, I haven't found anything for fire ants, but you can make them move. Okay, I'm going to have to research what to do about them. There must be some solution to deal with them. You might not be able to get rid of them, but should be able to at least control the damage that they do. Let's see. Okay, Russell says, I choose to grow bell and banana peppers. I've never tried banana peppers. I haven't even had it to eat yet. I was looking at them in the stores last year and thinking maybe I should try those, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. Let's see. Decaying organic matter plus bacteria equal compost plus bacteria plus worms equal castings plus bacteria. Nice formula you've got there. Oh, hi, Melanie. Oh, so for the fire ants, you use serenity powder. That's good to know. I'm gonna jot it down in case someone should ask about that. Okay, let's see. I always do sweet peppers, scotch bonnets, chili, jalapeno, and I have started ghost peppers. They say are very hot. Ghost peppers gonna be a first. Okay. I've never grown ghost peppers here, but they are super hot. Serenity Blue says, okay, have not heard of it, but we'll check it out. Hi, Helpy. Okay, so let's see, where was I? Yes, what do you need to consider if you want to start a worm bin inside your home? There are a few points that you need to consider if you're going to raise worms inside your home. So you want to consider where you're going to keep your bin because that is going to affect several things. So where you're going to keep your bin, what type of bin will help you to control things like pests so that they won't get in because especially fruit flies, you don't want to have those or other flies or roaches and stuff like that in your worm bin. So you're gonna have to consider the type of bin that is best for keeping those out. The size of the bins that you're going to have, you need to consider as well because depending on where you're going to have your bin, the size of your bin must be able to fit there. So some people will keep their worm bin underneath their kitchen sink, or they might be able to keep it in the basement. Some might have a lot of space where they can keep the worm bins, some might have small amount of space. So that is going to determine the size of the bins that you're going to be using. Now, if your bin is going to be somewhere where visitors can see your worm bin, then you also have to consider a type of bin that is going to be aesthetically pleasing to the eyes, because you don't want people to visit your place and see your worm bin and be offended by it, or you being embarrassed by it. So if you're going to keep your bins inside your house, then you need to consider the appearance of the bin that you're going to get. So these are some of the factors that you would consider if you're keeping your worm bins in your house. Let's see. Matt Bajan says, also first will be asparagus. Oh, interesting. I've never grown asparagus. I bought it at the store once to eat, and my husband was like, "Where are you going with that?" Yeah, but it's not something that we, as in my family, I don't really know about others, but growing up, it wasn't something that we use, that we ate, and I guess it would be the same thing for my husband. So he was like, "Where are you going with that?" We did eat it, but I never bought anymore. So it would be nice to grow because it has pest repelling properties, but outside of that, I've never really grown it. Never had a reason to. I guess it would just go to waste if I did, unless I'm gonna grow it and then give it away to those who like it, because I know that Canadians definitely love their asparagus. You see, Russell says the banana pepper can be like cherry tomato, as they are great to eat out of the garden fresh. Oh, nice. Interesting. Now I really want to try it. Those sound great, Russell. Yes, here I get the serenity powder from the feed store where they sell things for the farm. Okay, that's good. How the sweet peppers doing? Sweet potatoes doing? A bit of bad news there. I'm certain that one is dead, and the second one look as if it is dying. None of them has produced any leaves yet. And the third one, it is pretty solid, so I'm guessing it is okay for now. Yes, but one is definitely dead. I'm just hoping that the other two won't die. Wilson says one of the most important things to learn when manufacturing worm, space management. I totally agree with you. Um, Especially if you're going to have a large worm farm, because space can be so tricky. And if you don't manage the space that you have, you can run out of space so easily. For me, I am struggling right now with space because my worm farm, most of you may have seen my worm farm shelving that I made, and you'll notice that I have a tiered system. Prior to that, I had uh, a worm farm that I built that was 4 feet high. The depth of the actual worm farm was 2 feet, and then underneath you would have 2 feet of open space because it was a flow through system. And it was 2 feet, sorry, not 2 feet, 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. And I loved that bin. It worked really, really well. The only problem I have is space. So I dismantled that and created the first worm shelf, and then I made the second worm shelf. So I have more space. So the same space that the first bin occupied, I'm using the same space to have twice as much worms. But the problem I'm having now is the castings. Where do I store my castings? Where do I store my worm farming equipment? Because I have them in the garage. The garage is used for if we have to do any repairs on any vehicles. And If I have any project that I need to make in the winter, then I need to be in the garage. So I cannot take over the full garage. My husband has some of his tools stored in there. And because of that, there is no space. And it is really, really hard to deal with when you don't have a lot of space. So, whatever space you have to do your best to maximize what you can get out of it. Let's see, Russell says 1 out of 3 is better than zero. Yes, that is so true. LP says, "Oh no, your sweet potatoes." That's exactly how I feel. And you know the funny thing, I would feel better if it is one of those that I produce myself that is dying, but then because Melanie went through so much effort to send it to me, I'm just like, it's sad. Yeah. Okay, very good perspective. Yes, I'm sorry that they're not doing well, but I guess that's all a part of life. The one that died, I kind of suspected that it would because it had a bit of mold on it. I guess it was traveling for too long. I don't know. According to the postal system, they're having quite a lot of difficulty these days with shipping. So things tend to take longer than they should. So it's no surprise that at least one of them died, but I'm hoping that the other two will make it. Okay, so Macbejan says fried with butter or bitter garlic. It's fantastic. Oh, interesting. Goes with your rice or potatoes. Now, this time the asparagus will taste even better because I grew it myself. I can't wait. Yeah, everything tastes better when you grow it yourself. No more harmful chemicals, provided you're not one who uses chemicals on your plants. And even if you use chemicals, you have a better idea of what you're using rather than when you go to the store, there's no preservative sprayed on them and everything. So, yep, got to taste a whole lot better. Let's see. I live on a farm. No one will be surprised at what they find in my house. Okay. Just move a bottle, feed. Just move the bottle, feed a goat kid out last month. Keep in dog kennel at night, inside, or in a chick, or a chick in my apron. Yep, that's the farming life. But it's a lot of work, but I guess it's also a lot of fun. LP says, I guess we can all look at dead plants as room saved for another. It's a nice way of looking at it, eh? Rosa says, I stored my bedding in 55-gallon drums. I dropped the castings in the same 55-gallon drums during the winter months. In the summer months, it is 2 tons stored. Okay, that is a lot. That is quite a lot. How many started out thinking I'll do one bin hobby mindset and ended up with 6 or 7 of them? Interesting because when I started my worm bin, I wasn't even thinking about having a worm farm. I was thinking more compost, but then during my research, I learned that there is such a thing as worm castings and that the worms can compose my material faster. So, my only intent when I started was just to have worms composting my food scraps faster because in my region it can take you an entire year to make compost, and I don't want to be sitting and waiting a whole year. So when I learned of wormy composting. So I decided to get a pound of worms. But by the following year, well, within 2.5 months, when I harvested my first worm castings and saw the amount that I had and the amount that the rate that the worms reproduced, then I was so excited. So the following March, I started selling worms, and here I am now. I never knew I would have so many worm bins, but yep, it's worth it though. It's a lot of fun. Let's see, LP says, I have 2.5 storage bin. I'm tempted to start another to raise ENC. Let's see, I started out with a compost bin and ended up with 3 worm bins. Yes, it's always like that, eh? I flip buckets. The commercial farms flips of pallets of buckets all year long. Yeah, you know, I'm really worried about where I'm gonna store my casting after I've harvested them for this summer, because I know I'm not gonna have the ones that I have now because I'm gonna be selling those pretty soon. But the ones that I'm going to be harvesting at the end of the growing season, I don't know where I'm going to put them because every year I have more castings than the previous year. At that point in time, when the growing season is up, nobody is buying castings, which means I'm going to have to find somewhere to store them. And they can't be outside because your castings must not be allowed to freeze. So I don't really know where I'm going to be storing them. So I'm thinking, is there anything in this garage I can get rid of? Hopefully, some people don't know that I'm getting rid of stuff. Yeah, is there anything that I can get rid of to create space for those castings? But anyway, I'll find a way. I will definitely have to find a way. I might have to get a few more of those 55-gallon drums, but then I pretty much used up all of the 55-gallon drums that I have. I've got what, two there, six of them, and I don't have enough because I use two for water for my worms in the winter, and then two. One is a European nightcrawler bin, and the other one I just created another European nightcrawler bin. I'm just waiting for those European nightcrawlers to get here. I need one to put on the front of my property to catch the water that's coming off the roof because there is nothing catching that water, and I need that to use to water the front lawn. So I don't have enough, but then and again, where do I get the space to store it, even if I get one to store the castings? But that's a lot of castings you're flipping there, Russell. Yeah. I guess once you get started in this line of business, it's important to always be expanding the space that we have. And especially in my region where you only have 3 to 4 months of growing season. So you have to be flipping these things pretty fast and get rid of them. Yes, so how many worms do you actually need to start a worm bin? A good amount to start off with is about a pound of worms. If it is red wrigglers, then it would be roughly 1,000 mature worms. And the reason why you want to start with a pound and not more than a pound is because if you're just starting out, it's possible to make mistakes and you could lose all of your worms. You don't want to invest a lot of money buying a lot of worms and then something goes wrong and you lose all of that. Because while the supplier would benefit from the resources they got from you, you would be at a loss. So starting off with just a pound is a pretty good idea, a pretty good amount to start off with. If you are someone who thinks that it's not going to work out for you because you're going to have issues, you might want to start with half pound, but 1 pound is the ideal amount. Motivation says, congratulations on your success and thank you for sharing your knowledge. I wanted to eliminate buying castings. I'm going to start a small worm bin and all my info comes from you. Thank you. Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad that I was able to help you. That's pretty good. LP says, I started with 250 red mix and 100 ENC. I wish I'd gone ahead with a pound. It does take a while for them to do their stuff, and if you have a lot of food scraps, then yeah, starting with less than a pound is not so ideal because it will take too long for them to actually process the food scraps that you have. Newark says, every time I watch your channel, I think I should start a worm bin. Well, if you do, my dear, it will definitely be worth your effort. And you said you're in Texas, right? Which means that it is going to be even better for you because your worm bins can be outdoors. For the most part, your worm bin can be outdoors. Let's see. LP says, Macbejan, welcome to the worm party. It's a very nice party. If I saved castings for the winter time, I would not be able to get ready for the springtime. Unfortunately, there is always a late autumn or early winter call of worms. Oh, that's good. That's good. You're able to keep it going. I'm not that fortunate. I'm not that fortunate because my growing season is just too short. So there are some occasionally you have some farmers who have greenhouses that will want castings in the fall, like the early part of fall, but throughout the winter, there's no need for it. Let's see. Serenity says, how do you deal with the heat? It was 110 a couple of days last summer. Whoa. Um, well, I don't know how you deal with the heat, but in terms of for your worms, it's a good idea to have them somewhere that is shaded. So, and you have to be careful of what container you're raising them in if you're living in areas that gets really hot. So, like metal containers is not the best thing for them. Or if you have things like plastic totes, it's a good idea to keep it in a shaded area because some of the worms definitely cannot stand the heat. And it is better to get things like your African night crawlers and your blue worms if you're going to be dealing with a lot of heat. Now, I hear that the blue worms tend to love to wander around. So, if you're going to be raising blue worms, just know that they tend to travel a lot. How much they travel, I don't know because I've never really tried raising them. Maybe if I was somewhere warm, I would, but I've never raised them myself, so I don't know much about how they travel. Let's see. Bayesian says, thank you, LP. Only once I find a farm in Ontario that wants to sell more than 300. Almost hard to do. All others sold out. Odd, I thought. It's not difficult to get sold out on worms unless you have a really, really big farm, or if your worms are those that produce really well. My worms are in the summer, my worms are like just like that. Just they're just producing, producing, producing. But then once I put them in my garage, they're like, nope, let's go to sleep. And wife says, I started my worm slash compost bin because of you too. Yeah, good. It means less people are having food scraps going into the landfill. Let's see. LP and unwhite. I got to do more research on how to get started. It does not really take much to get started on a worm with a worm farm. Pretty much what you need is just the container to raise your worms in. And if you're going to have a catchment tray, then you need that as well. And bedding for your worms. Newspaper or shredded paper works pretty well if you don't have anything else that you can use, or cardboard. And you source your worms, and there you go. You are right, just like that. That's all you need. And then you just keep feeding them your food scraps. So it does not really take much. You just have to monitor the moisture content in the bin and make sure that you're not feeding things like meat and dairy or acidic food. That's pretty much. And then you have to be careful of the temperature too. So it doesn't really take much to get started. Sourcing the worms might be the biggest challenge you have in getting started with a worm farm. Let's see. LP says, I do feel there was a bit of learning curve for me with my first bin, but that was because I refused to feed them small amounts. um, when you're just getting started with worms, it is so easy to just keep putting the food scraps in the bin because the food scrap is there and the worm is there, so why not? But yeah, you can overfeed them. But in my situation, it was a bit different when I started out with the worms, because when I bought it, it was the 26th of June, and so it was summer, and the lady came and dropped off the worms, and I didn't have a worm bin, but I have a compost bin. I had a 4x4x4 compost bin. And so she just put the worms in there. So the entire bin was full of food and the worms just processed it. So there was no issue about overfeeding them or underfeeding them. And I just keep the bin moist. That was the only thing I did for 2.5 months. Keep the bin moist, and every food scraps that came out of the house went into the compost bin. And they did pretty well. I had 20 times the amount that I started out with within 2.5 months. I was so excited when I saw that increase, and I thought, oh, yes, this is good. But you know, the sad thing, it never happened again. June coming is going to make 4 years, and I've never seen that increase, even in the outdoor bin. And my outdoor bin, I put worms, my compost bin, I put worms in it every year. And I do see a drastic increase in the worm population, but I've never again seen 20 times that amount. So I'm like, what? Am I doing something wrong? Because I'm doing the exact same thing I did the first year, but I don't know. I've never seen that increase again. I'm so disappointed. Oh my Lord, I can't tell you how disappointed I am. But I guess that is life. New York Garden says, can I use ones that in the garden already? Are you talking about worms that are in your garden already? If those are regular earthworms, then no, because regular earthworms are not good composting worms. They are very good composters, but they require space. They don't like restrictions, and they are burrowing worms. They like to burrow deep down into the soil. They will harm themselves if you try to raise them in containers, because they will try to burrow down through the bottom of your bin, and that is going to hurt them because there's no way they can put holes in whatever you're using for your worm bin. So if it is regular worm bin, if it is the regular earthworms, then no, they wouldn't work. Let's see. LP says, I feel for you. That would be a bummer. I wonder what the difference is. Yeah, I don't know. I've tried to figure out what it was. And to this day, I cannot figure it out. I don't have a clue what made the difference. And I can't say it is because I'm feeding them food scraps, because once they go out in my compost bin, it is food scraps and not compost that they're getting. So I don't know what the difference is, but anyway, I hope one day I will figure it out. Let's see. Russell says, "Have you tried using worm tea yet?" Um, I think I did worm tea last year. I don't know how I did it. And the only reason why I did it is because I was making the worm tea for a video, but I've never really used worm tea per se because I've always had a lot of castings, so I've never really used the worm tea apart from the ones that I use for the video. Then I didn't want it to go to waste, so I use it in the garden. But to make the worm tea as is, no, I've never done that. But I might be doing it this year because it, as you told me, it is good as a pesticide. So yeah, I think I will definitely try it for that reason. CLB says, I would say, New York Gardener, you're better off going ahead and getting a small batch. 250 wasn't good for me just because I had too many food scraps. Yeah, that would work. Starting off with a small amount, and then it's easier to source them if you only source in a small amount, because you might be able to get them at a gas station or a Walmart or some local supplier around you, or maybe you might have friends who do worm farming and you can get a few from them. So yeah, starting off with a small amount is good. Right. So now that we have, let's see, cocoons mean happy worms, right? I've collected 124 from 120 worms in my worm bin. Nice. I put them in a small plastic container to watch and see how many they produce. It's a nice little experiment. I would be going back constantly and just looking in there, looking in there. Is there any new ones? You would think that after 4 years I'm used to it, but every time I put eggs in a container, I'm just constantly going back. Is there any young ones yet? Um, Let's see. Leafy says, I am coming to Saskatoon tomorrow. Is it possible to buy a pound of worm? Mm, let's see. I might have to give you an order that I have prepared for another client. She's not coming on till sometime next week. But I usually take some time to prepare them. Yes, I might have to give you someone else's order for now. But yes, you can get a pound. Let's see. LP says, I should have said instead of collecting from your garden. But I do agree that a pound is best. But if you are intimidated, you could start with like 500. Mm. Worm casting tea once a week is all the fertilizer plants will need to be very, very productive. I guess that is one of the advantages of using worm cast, the worm tea too, is that you can use a small amount of castings and create the worm tea, so you get a wider coverage. But then using the worm castings, you don't really need to use a lot, because whatever amount you would use when you buy manure or other compost from the compost depot, you're going to use one fifth of that in castings for your garden, because castings contain 5 times more nutrients than, at least 5 times more nutrients than compost and other form of animal droppings. So yeah, but the worm tea, I'm definitely going to be using that this year to see how it work out. Or you'll be making some tomorrow, Han White. Okay. I Billy, blessed are the saints of the solid garments. With blessed are the saints with soiled garments. I don't know what that means. Okay, so for those of you who are big time worm farmers, I guess that means most of you guys. There's a question I would like to ask because I'm still trying to figure out what's going on. Oh, hi, Hable, tropical fruits. Yes, there's something I'm trying to figure out because I can't tell what's going on. But like I mentioned before, when my worms are outdoors, it doesn't matter if they're in my worm bin or they're in my compost bin, they reproduce like crazy. I know that in the summer, whether they're indoors or outdoors, they're going to produce like crazy because the weather is what's best for them. But then when I have them in my garage, I know it's winter, so they're going to slow down and I expect them to slow down. But they don't even double their amount over the winter. Never. From the time I put them outdoors in the garage in the 4 years, so they have been in the garage for 3 years, they have never ever doubled their amount in the winter. So I'm trying to figure out what is it that is going on. It's not a matter of what they're fed because when I had my original worm bin that was fed food scraps and newspaper and shredded leaves, it was the same thing, the same result, and they had sufficient moisture in there. They had the temperature. I keep the temperature in the garage at the same temperature constantly, except for in the summer I turn off the heat. My bins are not acidic, so why is it that they are? Do they slow down to that extent where they won't even double their amount in the winter? I don't know. I've been trying to figure it out because to me it makes no sense. Are they aware of the barometric pressures outside of the garage, and is that why they're slowing down to that extent? So I don't know because they're making castings, but then their population is just not even doubling. So I don't know what is going on. If maybe I'm doing something wrong, as far as I know, I am not. But then I don't know everything. So what is your suggestion? Oh, you just came. You just came from Lowe's buying fertilizers. No, I wish you. Okay. So you wish you had worm castings. Yeah. So is worm casting available in your region? I know it can be a bit pricey though, but in terms of how far worm castings can stretch and the benefits that outweighs that of other fertilizers in terms of production, in terms of the taste of your food, in terms of being able to control certain pathogens, then even though it's a bit pricier, it is well worth it. Happy to hear that. I'm white. Okay. Leafy says, maybe just the fresh air. Possibly. That's one possibility. Maybe it has to do with the air pressure or any other atmosphere factors. I just bought 4 different kinds of poppy seeds. Nice. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what it is. I know that I need to change my garage door because I think part of the freezing that took place in the garage this winter, is because the door does not seal properly. I have a 1 inch gap in between there. So I don't know. Maybe that's what is affected them. I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out, but hopefully I will have the time to get the door changed this summer and to see if that make a difference because it's crazy. They're eating, they're making castings, but their population, and when you look in there, you're seeing a lot of eggs, but then nothing. Yeah, so I don't know. So I was thinking that this thinking that I'm gonna just put a few of the worms outdoors this winter and then just let the existing worm bin stay in the garage. But I think I'm going to put almost all the worms I have outdoor into my compost bin because then all of them are going to be reproducing drastically. So even if the worms don't do so well over the winter, I will still have tons of worms. So we'll see how it goes, but I really hope I can get to change the garage door quickly so I can see what's going on with them. LP says, this July will be my first year with worms, so I'm still learning. I haven't harvested yet again since winter, so I don't know how mine reproduce through the winter. Oh, okay. Well, time will tell, eh? Time will tell. Okay. My daughter wants to get back in here for resting. Let's see. I wonder if it has anything to do with the humidity, or maybe there is a draft they sense. Have you looked into the EMC Big Bin anymore? Um, I haven't looked in there since I did the last video on it last week, so I don't really know what's going on in there just yet. That bin I'm a bit concerned about because it is pretty close to the door, and if I put it to the back of the garage, it's going to be very cold in that region. But I'm going to be doing a lot of work on the garage if all goes well this year in terms of insulating it. So I'm going to get rid of all of the lowest shelves that I have on both sides. I'm going to be eliminating those as worm shelves and just put insulation there so that even if the garage get cold, then it will have insulation on the bottom and help to keep the worms a little bit warmer. Yeah, but it's a lot of work that I need to get done in there. How do the ones in deeper materials do versus the more shallow containers? Mine are about 6 to 8 inches or so deep. Okay. Well, the worms in general do well the more space they have. So if you have deep material, then the worms are going to be happy if you fill the material with bedding, not necessarily food scraps, because then you will have too much food in there for the worms to eat. They won't process it fast enough, and you can end up with problems in a worm bin. But if you fill the bin with a lot of bedding and then just add food scraps when you're ready to feed them, then they will have a lot of space to run up and down in. When the worms sense that they have a lot of space and food is consistent, then they will reproduce faster. I've used both method in the garage. So as I mentioned, the previous worm bin that I had last summer in the garage was 2 feet deep, and when fall came and I transferred the worm into the garage, I filled it with leaves all the way to the very top and then feed them food scraps from time to time. Well, consistently they were being fed food scraps. They still did not reproduce very fast. Another thing I'm wondering is, are the mice actually eating the worms? Because there's always a lot of babies in the worm bin, but then for whatever reason, the worm population does not grow as fast as it should. So I'm wondering if maybe the mice are actually eating the worms as well. I don't know. But anyway, after this year, they won't be able to get into my worm bin. So I guess it would be good if I could actually do one project instead of two. So if I could probably rat proof or mice proof my worm farm, then I could observe the way they reproduce over the winter and know if it is the case where the mice was eating them, as opposed to doing that and the garage door at the same time. But it's going to be difficult not to do the door because that's heat that is being wasted and we have to pay for that. So yeah, it would be interesting if I could figure out which it is, or if it is any of those factors that is affecting them, or if it is just the barometric pressure that the worms are responding to. Well, anyway, time will tell. Yes, because the funny thing is, I have seen the mice dropping on the worm shelf, and those shelves, those bins are not being fed food scraps. So I should not be seeing their droppings on it. But that would be an indication that they are going around and searching in my bin. So I don't know if they're eating it. So I already have the screen that I'm going to be using to make the cover for each of the worm bins, but then these mice bite through those covers. So I'm going to be using my 1/4 inch mesh to enclose the entire shelf or shelves. That way they can't get in, and then I'm going to be using the mesh to keep the fruit flies out. So I've got so much to do this summer, but one thing at a time. Eventually I will get it done. Yeah, so pretty soon I'm going to be ending this live so that my daughter can come back in here for her schooling. She's doing it outside there where her little brother is, and I can hear his mouth going. So I know he's a distraction for her. That's a great idea. You can do it. Okay, thank you for the encouragement, LP. Okay, so I think that's about it for this discussion. It was nice talking with you all. It was fun. I got to relax my face muscles some more. Let's see, I have a ton of work to do too, so I understand, but I try to stay excited about what it will be in the end. Yes, me too, because when you focus on the outcome, the final outcome, then it motivates you to keep going even sometimes when you're very tired and you'd rather not be doing it. You're wondering if you should email me for the worms? Yeah, sure. Let's see, Russell says, when I put castings from 6 to 10 inch night crawlers in a clear bag, it looks like a bag of mice dropping. It does? Interesting. Wow, that's a large size pebbles. Yeah, so I'm gonna be saying goodbye for now. I will see you guys on Monday when we are discussing our gardening topic. I haven't selected a topic yet. I'm behind this month when it comes to getting my videos recorded on time and scheduled for viewing and then preparing for my live. So hopefully as soon as I finish my work outdoors, I'll be able to get back on track. But until then, I'll just have to take it a day at a time. LP says, nice live. Thank you for your time and knowledge. I look forward to following along with your projects. That's the other cool part. You'll have that much more content to share. That's true. Okay, take care. Bye, mom. All right, so enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm glad you were able to enjoy it. So until I see you guys on Monday, stay safe and have a wonderful weekend.